Welcome to Confidential Remarks. If you're listening to this, you already know the point of this podcast. These are the conversations that usually happen off the record, behind closed doors, when people stop posturing and start being honest. What we're talking about today isn't theory, and it isn't opinion. It's based on public data, long-term industry reporting, and patterns anyone can see if they're willing to look directly at them. Most people still think real estate is one industry, one license, one job, one basic path to success. But that hasn't really been true for a long time. Quietly, real estate has split into two very different worlds operating under the same license. One side is productive, visible, and financially viable. The other is much larger, mostly invisible, and struggling to get traction. That divide is what we're going to walk through today. When the industry talks about success, this is usually the profile it points to, the so-called median agent. About 12 years in the business, some referrals, some repeat clients. A career that looks stable and respectable from the outside. This is the version of success most people are shown. It's the example used in presentations, recruiting conversations, and association reports. And if you're listening to this and thinking, that sounds pretty reasonable, that's kind of the point. The official story goes something like this. Around 10 transactions a year, a few million in volume, over a decade of experience. These numbers get repeated so often they start to feel like a destination. Like, if you can just hang on long enough, this is where you'll end up. For a long time, this story worked. It gave people something to aim for. It made the business feel predictable. But this is where we need to slow down. That story isn't wrong exactly. It's just incomplete. And averages have a way of hiding what's actually happening underneath. When you stop looking at the middle and start looking at the full distribution, a very different picture shows up. In a single year, roughly 70% of licensed agents didn't close a single transaction. Not one. That's not a rounding error. That's the majority of the industry. And those agents aren't on the outside looking in. They're licensed, they're active, they're paying dues, they're just not transacting. If you expand the view just a little, almost half of all agents closed one deal or fewer in an entire year. At that point, this stops being about motivation or hustle. It becomes a structural issue. The system allows massive participation, but only a small fraction ever builds enough momentum to sustain real production. Now, look at the other side of the spectrum. The top 5% of agents handle nearly all the transactions. And inside that group, only a tiny fraction are closing more than 45 homes a year. These agents aren't just doing a little better, they're playing a completely different game, with different systems, expectations, and economics. When you compare agents by experience, the gap becomes obvious. Newer agents are averaging a couple of transactions a year. Highly experienced agents are doing many times that. Experience compounds in this business. Relationships compound. Systems compound. And once someone pulls ahead, it gets easier to stay ahead. This is also why brokers tend to outperform sales agents in transaction volume. They're closer to leverage, they control more of the workflow. They're better positioned to benefit from scale. It's not about effort, it's about where you sit in the structure of the business. When you stack all of this together, it looks less like a bell curve and more like a pyramid. A massive base of agents doing little or nothing, a narrow middle, and a very small group at the top carrying almost the entire market. Once you see the industry this way, a lot of confusion suddenly makes sense. The biggest takeaway is this. The median agent is mostly a statistical idea. It's useful for reports, but it doesn't reflect lived reality. Real estate today is a business of extremes. You either build momentum, leverage, and consistency, or you stall out. Success here isn't about being average. It's about understanding where the real leverage is and making deliberate choices to move toward it. I'll close the way we started. This isn't about judging anyone's career or predicting anyone's future. It's about being honest about the landscape we're operating in. Because once you understand the business as it actually exists, not the version we like to talk about publicly, you can make clearer, smarter decisions about how you want to participate in it. That's the point of confidential remarks. Thanks for being here.